Airborne Division. So this will be a slightly tilted 101st Airborne Division version of the Battle of the Bulge history, but that's the best version to get anyways. So we'll move on from there. I wanted to start with a few pictures. This is how I always begin any talk, is try to hook you in with some imagery of what we're going to see here. The easiest thing for Battle of the Bulge is that it's not a battle with an abstract name that you can't get immediately. So here's the map. What is the Battle of the Bulge? It is a battle that's named after the big punch into the American and British and Canadian and French lines for the western side of the front in Europe in World War II. So you can see this kind of imagery right here. These red lines are the German advance, and the blue lines are the Allied retreat and movements in those areas as they punched into mainly American forces in an area called the Ardennes Forest. And I'll get into why that was the area, why they chose to attack the U.S. Army, and what their goals were as we move on. So then we've got, we'll go to the bottom left corner here next, and that is the current day memorial in Europe along the axis of advance there, the memorial to the Battle of the Bulge that exists there. And it's a small picture just to fit into this collage, but you can, if you go there, find the state of South Carolina commemorated on one of those wings of that building. And if that was a bigger picture, you'd see South Carolina written there on that side of it. So the top left corner, we're going to come back to particularly two of these soldiers that are standing there. This is one of the things that the battle is incredibly famous for. And I'll talk about because of my own bias. This is a Battle of Bastogne, which is part of the Battle of the Bulge. It's a city or a little village, to be much more honest, that was encircled during the battle, and held inside of that encirclement was most of the 101st Airborne Division. And you see there 301st soldiers with the Bastogne village sign. Just because of how biased I am, I have one of those on the wall in my garage. It's gone with me everywhere I've gone in life. So that sign is never far from me. And then this tank here is chalked on the side of it is the wording "First in Bastogne," where that tank breaks through to the encircled 101st as the Americans and British allies and Canadians are fighting their way back into collapsing the Bulge toward the end of the battle. So there's kind of an intro for us. Let's move on to some facts that kind of get the territory of the battle all laid out before we go into the details of how things went. This map here is the line as it existed, say, the day before this battle really begins, before the German attack. So if you look at the area right here, there's Bastogne. That's going to end up encircled. This is Luxembourg, which is along the Ardennes forest. This area right here is going to be the main battle line. And it's the terrain that it's been chosen for. And not only the terrain, but also what the Germans thought that terrain would allow them to do and where they wanted to end up if they had been successful in their battle. But I think that the fast facts here are pretty important to why people end up talking about the Battle of the Bulge to this day, 80 years after the event. There are many different 80-year anniversaries of a battle that Americans participated in World War II that we could have picked. But why do people normally pick the Bulge? It's because of these facts and figures here, I think. 700,000 plus American service members take part in the Battle of the Bulge. It remains the largest single engagement ever fought by the United States military. Nothing has really ever come close to that.
Wow.
There are lighter, unfortunately, battles that the United States military has taken part in, but nothing has involved as many soldiers in the German attack and then the process of pushing the Germans back. It's just still out of all proportion to other engagements that we've fought. 81,000 casualties, and maybe I'm telling you things that you already know, but just for those of you who might not, casualty kind of gets I think it's often a misnomer, especially among my students. So that's why I've started to explain it. Casualties not only killed, it includes all effects that take a soldier off the battlefield. So casualty includes those killed, those wounded, those missing, and when the numbers just don't match, that person is counted as a casualty. So 81,000 casualties, 8,400 killed, 46,000 wounded, and 20,000 missing. Most of those missing, of course, were in some form of captured by the Germans. So this is another one of the reasons why I think Battle of the Bulge is really important, is that it's the last offensive, not just last major, but last offensive by Nazi Germany really at all. This is kind of Hitler's last throw of the dice, if you want to put it that way. It is ordered all the way up from the top by him. It's his idea. He is, by this point in the war, micromanaging the German war effort, and he is sliding toward mental imbalance. He's not at the point where he's begun ordering around formations that don't even exist from his bunker, but his life will end in that sort of vein. As a Holocaust historian, that's my main job and my main area of historical study. I'm pretty versed more in following his trajectory than I often am thinking about the war front. But in this battle, they coincide. So Hitler is here taking the reins. He thinks he has a great idea for how to turn the tide that is very much against him. So to think about that tide, that's where we're going to go next. But let me first talk about where everything was, the battle in context before December 15th, you could say, all the way up to December 15th. These red lines are where the battle fronts stood on the day before the Bulge. So in the West, if you can see Brussels right here, the British are up in this area. The United States takes over all the way down to about here. And then there are French units, recently constituted, of course, after the liberation of France, that are fighting along these sort of supposedly quieter sectors down here in Alsace-Lorraine around Strasbourg. The Bulge will be coming in this direction. Over here in the east, this is the Soviet battle line, and the German lines, along with their, along with their Romanian or Hungarian allies, what's left of them by this point. Their battles are almost over by this point, being liberated or captured, depending on their points of view. Warsaw has not yet fallen. It's coming. And most, we should say, of the German Wehrmacht or the German army is employed along this eastern line. The far larger fight in World War II is along this eastern front. And this is part of Hitler's decision making in attempting to go for an attack on the United States and Great Britain in the Battle of the Bulge. They have been in retreat almost nonstop from their loss in the Battle of Stalingrad in February of 1942. So they've been, after years of advance, you could say peacetime advance from 1933 all the way to beginning of the war in 1939, pretty much unmitigated successes for Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1942. And then they spend from 42 to the end of the war in retreat with minor hiccups along the way, or in the case of the Battle of the Bulge, a much larger sort of turn of the tide for a second, even though it was really never going to be sustainable for them. So what I'm trying to set up here is the idea that what Hitler himself and his generals are trying to come up with here is a way to turn the tide. And what's not available to him is any idea that they could ever reconstitute the German army to the size it once had been, that they could ever find the manpower to repel the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at the same time. That's just impossible. Even Hitler can understand that. So his hope instead is to break the Allied line in the West, make the war too costly for the United States and the British, particularly, and force the Western allies to sue for peace or to negotiate a peace with Germany and become their ally in a pushback of the Soviets. Hitler is still advancing his idea that the Western allies can be his racial friends and join him in a fight against the supposed Untermenschen, the supposed less than humans of the Slavic communist East. So he's
Hmm.
hoping to try to punch the Allies in the West and bring them into some sort of concerted attack with him to save Germany from this onslaught in the East, because he's really losing much faster there and in far greater numbers. Germans are dying along that Eastern Front at a rate just out of all proportion to what's going on here in the East. And the way that it's being fought in the East is another thing that maybe I'll come back to when I talk about some of the ways that started to show up in the bulge. So there's a lot of map context, sort of discussion of that context too. This is me trying to put that into some words that are a little bit faster to take away here. So Eastern Front, where is Germany at this phase? Vastly outnumbered, in retreat since Stalingrad. Italy, the Allies have advanced north of Rome. There is also a little known Axis offensive there that occurs in December of 1944. And let me cover the Western Front and then come back to that as a sort of curio. The Western Front, we have the Normandy landings, maybe just reminding you the exact date. Probably most of the audience does know, though. June 6, 1944. So since June, the Allies have been pushing in from Normandy. The big breakout occurs in August of 1944. And that means that most of northern France gets liberated in August of 44. Then you have Operation Market Garden in September. Market Garden is the attempt using airborne forces to push through Holland and Belgium and kind of go around the Western Wall defenses of Germany itself and come in from the north with a lot of sloganeering and hopeful words being said about ending the war by Christmas in 1944. Of course, we're dealing here, I think it's important to say, especially as Americans, Normandy, Market Garden, and Battle of the Bulge all become the subjects of 1960s epic films that we've probably all seen. So these are all in that realm, and they're all part of how we remember this battle. Anytime I would teach about this, I would definitely bring up those films and talk about, okay, why were these all coming out at the same time? How is memory important to this? Who was the audience for these movies? We'll come back to that at the very end, though. So we're up to Market Garden. The name of that film and the problem with that battle, a bridge too far, right? What we have there is a ambitious schedule that does not quite come to fruition. I'm going to leave it there instead of getting into the real minutia of Operation Market Garden. But one of the reasons it's important to this is that Market Garden involves most of 18th Airborne Corps for the United States military and allied forces that are part of that corps, particularly a Polish brigade, which means that after having fought very hard in Market Garden, those units have been either placed in reserve or placed in what was thought to be quiet sectors of the front to recuperate. And that's going to be really important for the 101st because it's already kind of been through the ringer and is going to have to go back into it when this surprise offensive happens. So then, last piece of context for battles that are occurring just before, or in this case, right before, is the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, September 19th to December 16th. So literally, all the way up to the day that the Battle of the Bulge begins, is the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. This is America's first major attempt to push into German territory proper. And it is again through one of these Black Forest type wooded areas that is so well prepared for defense that the casualties there for the United States Army particularly are really terrible. And many soldiers who gave oral histories after the war would talk about Hurtgen as the worst thing that they experienced. Battle of the Bulge, no picnic, but Hurtgen being a place where they were really put through hell. And then that is, unfortunately for them, it's the experience right before this Battle of the Bulge begins. So just to end this context, I was reminded when putting this together that it's kind of strange to say that in Italy there is also an Axis offensive, a German, mostly German, some of what's left of the Italian state offensive in December of 44. It's actually something of a victory because with the bulge happening, with so much else going on the Western Front and Allied forces not being dedicated to Italy, basically the decision is made that they're okay with retreating a little bit ways around along the Italian boot, and they're not going to really worry themselves with retaking that territory or pushing further north into the Alpine mountains, which would have become a really terrible place to try to fight the Second World War. So strange that we don't focus on that. It's a much smaller battle, which is one of the reasons we don't, of course, but there is also an offensive there in Italy that we'll leave it with that. So going to Nazi Germany, how it sets up for this fight. Germany is really building here its last offensive army. Its forces have already gotten to the point where you maybe have heard these phrases thrown around in studying wars that old men and little boys are showing up in uniform at this point. That's already going on. Germany is suffering a manpower problem from at least February of 1942, and that's getting worse all the time. From 1943, the German economy goes onto a full war footing where they're not producing consumer goods anymore. People are always, most of the time, people are surprised to hear that that's as late as 1943. The United States stopped producing consumer goods even much earlier than that. You won't find, for example, like model year automobiles from past about 1940. All of those factories have been switched into war production even before the United States is fully at war with all of the Axis powers. Germany does not. And as a Holocaust historian who's kind of more versed in what was going on inside of Nazi Germany most of the time, I would throw in there that one of the things you can take away from this, hopefully a curiosity that you'll read about in other ways, is that the fascist state, always thought of as so powerful and ruling over all of its people with an iron fist, the fascist state is actually a bit more worried about German public opinion than we remember. So it was not willing to put itself on a full war footing until 1943, when it had already been at war for almost 4 years, because they're worried about what the public will say or do. So this gives us an impression of how bad things are getting for them when they finally do that in 43. And when by the time we get to late 1944 here, they've really been through quite a bit. They've been in war footing for a while now, but they still, through the combined weight of Allied bombing and the attacks from north, well, not from north, but from west and east and south, if you count Italy, they're just pressed on all sides and having trouble keeping up with the demands of these fights. Their allies, of course, we look to Romania, Hungary, captured states, if you want to call them that as well, are more or less collapsing or completely collapsed by the time of the Battle of the Bulge. So Germany is finding itself increasingly alone. Mussolini's state has fallen, and by this point, he's been reappointed the leader of a thing called the Italian Social Republic that can only really claim to control far northern Italy, and he has virtually no power left. So the Germans are on their own, pressed in from all sides, low on manpower, low on materials, suffering from an almost complete lack of air air superiority would be one thing, but just even the ability to defend themselves in the air at all, the German Luftwaffe has taken quite a beating. So that's the position they find themselves in when Hitler decides to roll the dice on this attack and devote everything, all of his best items that he has left, all of his best people that he has left, his best armor. So, devoted particularly to this organization called Sixth Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, is the first SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, which would mean like lifeguard of Adolf Hitler. Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler is its name. They would actually find that on their collar cuff. Then the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. So the Hitler Youth there, that name means that those members of the SS had been raised through the Hitler Youth. They had aged by this point into being members of the SS itself, but had a background in the Hitler Youth. Of course, they also can't be very choosy at this point. That might not be a pure truth for these divisions. So those are supposed to be the spearhead of this attack. There'll be some other names that I bring up, but what we really need to get out here for how to understand the German attack is that it's going to have about 1,500 of the best, most technically advanced German tanks that are available. So these famous Tigers or King Tigers or Panthers or other versions of German Panzers. They're going to have their best artillery on this. They're 88 millimeter artillery pieces that have kind of become famous in American military lore. And really everything that they can throw at them. And they're going to take advantage of, not that they could have predicted it or even hoped for it, how lucky they got with it, the weather conditions that were prevalent around the time the battle began, which grounds most of the Allied Air Force, giving them a chance to move this armor into position. And they're also going to benefit from something that I think we don't focus on enough when we talk about the Battle of the Bulge, is that all the way up to this point, so advancing across northern France, the Western Allies had not yet come to a place where the people behind the lines were not their friends. I would put that in a different way. We had great intelligence gathering ability through the French, Belgian, and Dutch resistance, all the way up until we got to this area of the Battle of the Bulge. So we could always have been looking for the SOE to gather information about German movements and report them very reliably to us through the French resistance or so on and so forth. But by the time you get to the Ardennes and the border of Germany, the people behind those lines are not your friends. They're Germans. They're not going to be providing us with the intelligence that could keep us from being sneak attacked to such immense scale as happened in this area. So that lack of intelligence, because the people behind the lines have changed because of where the Allied armies have gotten to, the weather and the terrain features in both the kind of rolling quasi-mountainous area and the thick forest of the Ardennes, that's the advantage that the smaller and less well-equipped German military has. But it is also deploying its reserve, part of its reserve from central Germany, and it's sending some of its best, most experienced troops from the east, particularly in these panzer formations in the SS panzer armies. And that is going to have terrible effects for the people that they fight. So there's your run through of the German army. They call this Operation Watch on the Rhine or Die Wacht am Rhein. This goes back to an old German marching song called Die Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, which is a song that comes from like a long past of animosities along the French-German border. And up against them in this area, they're striking in a sector that's held by the 28th, 99th, and 106th Infantry Divisions in the United States Army. The 28th Infantry Division, which has the either great or terrible nickname, the Bloody Bucket, its patch is the one on the top there that is, I mean, one must admit, kind of bucket shaped, but it's the keystone of the state of Pennsylvania. It is largely made up of Pennsylvania National Guard. So it has a kind of particular home area that it comes from. The 99th and the 106th are more federal in that they come from all over the place. They don't have a particularly attached National Guard uh, location. I hope I'm not incorrect in that. They could have some units that are guard based, but they are federal. They are largely draftee by this point. And the two of the bottom divisions there, this checkerboard one right here is the 99th Infantry Division patch, and the one on the bottom there, the Golden Lions, it would have its nickname. The 106th is the one on the bottom there. I'm going to come back to this idea about how Americans remember this battle too, but part of starting down that road would be to say those two units don't exist in the U.S. Army anymore. They're not active duty units. Uh,
Hmm.
the Pennsylvania Division, the 28th Infantry Division, still exists as a part of the U.S. military through the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. But these two that were really kind of crushed in the early onslaught of Battle of the Bulge are not really maintained in the current military order of battle. The 106th, particularly, of a three regimental combat team division. Basically, two of those regimental combat teams are almost entirely destroyed in the early onslaught of the German army in the Bulge. So that's what they're up against. Why those divisions were there? They were all three supposed to be cutting their teeth. They were supposed to be learning how to fight by being deployed to a manageable sector, a place where they could learn how to fight while being somewhere that wasn't kind of the worst of the worst. It was thought that up toward the Netherlands there in this area, this would be the heavier fighting. Of course, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest is going on down lower. So this area is supposed to be where we could train troops along the line and get them used to combat without the heaviest stress. And then you could also put near that area uh, my my own unit, the 101st Airborne Division, to have them rest and recuperate somewhere near the line, but hopefully in a quieter area. So German intelligence may not have picked up on that perfectly, but they certainly did benefit from landing in an area that was so poorly held, to be blunt. So why there and why then? Um, Hitler and his allies, as I said before, Hitler and his commanders, I should say, are searching for a way to break the Western allies off of the Soviet East. And their way of doing that, they think, is going to be what I've drawn here in this red arrow. So this is going to be their envisioned hope for the Battle of the Bulge. Let's just say in reality, they get about to here, but what they really wanted to do was punch through the Ardennes and make a hard right turn toward Antwerp. Antwerp was the closest major supply port for the Allied military, and that the port's already damaged, so it's not operating at 100%. Supplies had been an issue since Normandy because we're dealing kind of with uh, ports that we've created ourselves or damaged ports that we've finally captured from the Germans. You may have heard of a kind of famous American military unit called the Red Ball Express that was a transport organization uh, built to bring supplies to the front as the front gets further away from Normandy, and that becomes a bigger and bigger problem. Part of this design is that the Germans are aware we're having those troubles, and they think if they can get to Antwerp, it'll have two benefits for them. Uh, Maybe I could expand that even to three. Um, First, it'll take that port away from the ability to resupply the Allied armies. Second, it will split the British away from the French, kind of recreate Dunkirk a few years after that had happened in 1939, 40, sorry. And it would also kind of maybe, if they're lucky enough, give them the ability to encircle these northern forces and force their surrender. So this whole plan is is really what you would almost call wish casting. Everything for the Germans would have to go absolutely perfectly correct and stay on schedule uh, for them to have had any chance at making this happen. And really, from the outset, they have trouble staying on schedule. They have a very ambitious schedule of when which unit will go through which town, when which German panzer unit, armored unit that is, will go down which road, and what must be done by certain phases of the battle. And they're behind it almost from the beginning. And that fall behind ratchets up their own frustration and anger with the resistance that they're facing, which has terrible outcomes that, of course, we'll also get to later on. One of the things I want to cover before I move on to some of my very, very biased coverage of the 101st Airborne Division is that as the main German thrust is coming through from December 16th, uh, these outnumbered and caught off guard and ill prepared, ill equipped American divisions that are holding this area, uh, many of them, they take on an order and a idea of having infantry companies sort of hunker down and try to just become a thorn, an immovable object in the way of the German army. Hold on as long as you can. An infantry company of as much as, like, say, 250 men, trying to kind of go to ground, if you might put it that way, where that company will just try to slow the Germans as much as they can before what's almost an inevitable surrender or being overwhelmed by the enemy. And those units fighting those last stands are hugely successful at terrible cost. They do slow down the German advance. They are able to take so much of what the Germans throw at them, and really all that they need to do is not win all of these little fights because they are almost predestined to lose because of what they have and what they are up against. But slowing the Germans down is the need that the overall commanders already understand. They have to throw them off this schedule, bottle them up on these tiny roads. What commends this area to being the line of attack is also what makes it terrible as a line of attack. What commends it is it's wooded. You can't see the attack coming. Even your superior air power, the United States and British Air Forces, can't see the massing of German troops preparing for this fight. But that also means on the flip side, you have these teensy tiny little European village roads to get a gigantic German tank down. So you have problems with that as much as you have benefits from that. So if the United States can kind of hold things off with these little companies left behind, and in the larger sense, with the 101st Airborne Division left behind, that is going to be massively disruptive to a very intricate German plan. And part of that is what happens at Bastogne. So we go back to another version of that picture. There's two people in that picture. There is Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe there on the left, and his operations officer, Colonel Kellum Kennard. Sorry, I was missing it. His name was on the next slide, so I reminded myself. But Colonel Kennard there. Um, Maybe an interesting curio. Hopefully, not all of you already know this, but uh, McAuliffe was the deputy division commander. The commanding general was away on leave when this attack happened. So the 101st gets surrounded without its commanding general. And the commander is attempting or demanding that the Air Force actually fly him in and paradrop him into the unit, and that doesn't actually happen. So the Battle of the Bulge for the 101st is fought under its deputy commanding general. But the idea there, what happens to the 101st is rather simple and probably part of the battle that many of you know. There's this small Belgian village named Bastogne that is What makes this village so important is that it is an intersection, basically. The village came to life around the intersection of several major roads. I mean, outside of the context of World War, they're not even really major roads. They're just thoroughfares to different parts. Uh, but what this becomes is sort of a hub, ways to take people in different directions that they need to get a hold of. The Germans, that is, need to get a hold of. And the 101st Airborne is rushed in off of rest after the Battle of Market Garden, thrown into Bastogne, and told to hold it at all costs, which it does. So within hours of its deployment to Bastogne, the unit is entirely surrounded, and it will end up spending Christmas in the freezing cold there under heavy, heavy German artillery bombardment. Probably most of you have seen that portrayed in one or another of the films that have made the unit famous because of its participation in World War II. And part of that fame comes from this. So Lieutenant General, eventually, H.W.O. Kennard II, was Division Operations Officer, which is to say like a third in command. He's in charge of like planning and creating the intricate timetables for the general's intent. Kennard himself is the person who suggested the famous nuts reply to the German demand of their surrender. So I can only see a couple of faces here, but by show of hands, for the couple of you that have your camera on, just to get a sense of where we're at, how many of you have heard the story of the 101st Airborne Division replying nuts to the German demand of surrender? Both. So we're gonna regard that as 100% of the audience has most likely heard about it. But by way of short refresher, the Germans they come to the 101st Airborne Division when it is encircled under white flag of truce. A couple of German officers are brought blindfolded to the division command with McAuliffe, and they deliver to him a long and very chivalrously worded demand for the surrender of the encircled American troops, as they call them. And this is Kennard's, what I'm about to play you is Kennard's version of that moment. So let's hear Kennard in his own words.
The German surrender ultimatum and the nuts reply by McAuliffe goes like this. On the 22nd of December, when the division was and had been totally surrounded by the Germans, the intelligence officer and I decided to take this to General McAuliffe. We first took it to the chief of staff, and the three of us and Colonel Harper then went in, woke up General McAuliffe, who was taking a bit of a nap, and told him that we had a surrender ultimatum. And Tony McAuliffe at first thought that the Germans were trying to surrender to us. But we told him, no, not so, that they want us to surrender to them, and they go on to say all the bad things that they're going to do if we don't do this. And he said, Tony McAuliffe then said, us surrender? Oh, nuts. And then he sort of pondered about whether he should answer and it should be in writing and so forth. And everybody agreed that there should be a written answer. And Tony McAuliffe then said, well, I don't know what to tell him. And I spoke up and said, well, what you first said would be hard to beat. And Tony said, what do you mean? And I said, you said nuts. And all of us in the room sort of thought that was a good answer. So Tony sat down and wrote out with a pencil, to the German commander, nuts, exclamation point, A.C. McAuliffe commanding, had his secretary type it out, gave the message to Colonel Harper, who took it back to his headquarters and gave it to the German armistice party. The Germans were allowed to take off their blindfold and read the message, and they were puzzled by it. And they were trying to translate nuts. And they said, nuts, was ist das? They didn't get it at all. And Colonel Harper said, if you don't understand it, it means go to hell.
So I was just so overjoyed to find that that oral history included that moment. Colonel Kennard, General Kennard, telling us in his own words how he was there when the nuts response came to life. Here in the background, and you could easily bring this up on Google, the Merry Christmas message of the 101st Airborne Division when it was encircled at Bastogne is also the words of Colonel Kennard, then Colonel Kennard. I love the way that this begins. It begins with the line, "What's merry about all of this, you may ask?" Because of the conditions they're under. And it goes on to say that because the division has turned back everything the Germans could throw at them, which was very, very true and part of the ability to slow down the German attack in this area. So if we move on from there to kind of where we headed for the end game of this battle, how will it come to an end? Because if the Germans could be thrown off schedule, which they were by these small infantry units staying behind and braving almost certain death or capture, and by the 101st staying at Bastogne, and just the weight of Allied material and manpower advantages, without every single thing going perfect for the Germans, it was almost certain to be a loss, which it ends up becoming because there is the will to fight back there. In the days after their initial advance, when the commanders can get their heads back around them and plan a fight back, Patton's Third Army is brought up from the south. It had been in this area further down toward the Hurtgen. It is moved by truck up to the southern side of the salient. Salient is another military term for a bulge in the line. And it attacks toward Bastogne. Then it also has the First Army, which is one of 12th Army Group's units commanded by Omar Bradley, that is pushing in from the north. And these two pushes from either side is called a pincer movement. And if you push on the two sides of the bulge, the Germans have to come to a conclusion that if they do not retreat, they are at risk of being cut off, encircled, and themselves forced to surrender. So, with a concerted amount of fighting there, the bulge is reduced by the day after today. January 16th is considered the end of the Battle of the Bulge. And just for our completely biased presentation of the Battle of the Bulge here, the 101st Airborne Division's official history to this day, you can look it up as the official history of the division written by the U.S. military's Center for Military History, does not say, refuses to admit that the 101st needed to be relieved. It says, sure, it was really nice of you, George Patton, to show up. It was great of you to get there when you did, but we didn't need you to. And just on unit pride, I'm sure that it never will be changed to be anywhere near more factual than it already is. So we move on from there to what is the aftermath of this battle. The German army has basically spent itself. It cannot recoup the losses suffered in the Battle of the Bulge. There will not be another major attack. Germany's manpower pool and its material ability will never put together new units in that way. If a newly named German division exists from this point forward, it's basically from collapsing other shattered units into a new whole. There's not the creation of some new thing after this. Western Allied attack resumes by February. So what does it cost us? A huge amount of lives, terribly, and about a couple of months. It did not have anywhere near, of course, the effect that Hitler wanted it to have. It does shatter his army in the West and possibly speed their collapse as things move on. It does, however, have an effect on American and British morale, particularly American morale, as we should remember that American young men fighting in Europe in the 1940s, when they had not yet liberated a concentration camp or seen the full effects of what Nazi Germany was. They were fully within their rights, and many of them were wondering why this had been forced on them, why they were taking time out of their lives to fight this war for what seemed like somebody else's problem. Much of that is is completely washed from their minds not long after the Battle of the Bulge, when the United States military and its British allies begin encountering Nazi concentration camps in person. You can do as much as you want of telling the troops that as you want, but until they actually see it with their own eyes, those are different effects. This map is showing you March 1945. Those you can see where the line is beginning to collapse here. The United States and the British will start moving in this direction. They will have Leipzig and they will be heading toward Berlin, but the Soviets, of course, take Berlin, and World War II finally comes to its merciful end in Europe on May 8th, 1945. So if that's our end game, what's a couple more things to remember in this battle? I wanted to come back to some sad things that go on here that are important to remember uh, just because of those who had to endure these things. The German SS units that are brought to the east to fight uh, in the Battle of the Bulge, including Kampfgruppe Peiper, which is led by a man named Peiper. So that's its battle group Peiper, is brought from the east along with many other German SS forces who had become accustomed to the idea of murdering their Soviet foes when they managed to capture them. And kind of the structures of the Battle of the Bulge and bringing those German units east and telling them that they must stay on this timetable brings out of them a style of fighting that was much more common in the East. It brings out of them these massacre attacks, decisions to just kill hundreds of Americans and others in fields after their capture. So a Senate investigation in the United States shortly after the war, this is about 1948, 1949, finds that Kampfgruppe Peiper under Joachim Peiper is responsible for the murder of 538 to 749 American POWs. Hmm. And part of that, or in that same area and on that same day, is the Weyreth or Vereth 11 massacre, which for racial reasons is the Germans murdering 11 African American troops who had been captured from the segregated 333rd Field Artillery Regiment. And this sort of thing is really part and parcel of what goes on in the East to enormous numbers. It's a point for us to remember the United States suffers around 450,000 killed in World War II, and Soviet Russia suffers around 20 million killed in World War II. This is the kind of fighting that went on in the East that Germany didn't normally perpetrate in the West, but the pressures of this plan of theirs and the redeployment of groups that had learned how to fight in the East has this effect of sort of bringing that terrible nature of war from the East to the West. And one other thing that I think is really interesting point, second to last thing I'll be talking about here, is how the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge start to change America in ways that we won't really realize until a good 20 plus or more years later. But under the pressures of the Hurtgen Forest battle and the Battle of the Bulge, the United States is starting to even come near exhausting its own available manpower pool and needs to start taking a look at decisions that we make based on our own societal organization at the time. The U.S. military was segregated in World War II, as we should all know. And what goes on here is that under the pressures of trying to find 20,000 replacement soldiers for those who had been killed, wounded, and captured in the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge, there's a decision to create something that we could call, and was called at the time, fifth platoons. Infantry companies are generally organized into four line platoons, first through fourth platoon, and the fifth platoon is going to be a black unit attached to a white infantry company. So this is kind of like the precursor to desegregation in the United States military, which comes in 1948.
Hmm.
This precursor comes with the need to replace and make good all of the massive amounts of casualties that have taken place in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge. So these two battles have people always ask you, like, how can you attach social history to warfront history? And this is very much one of those ways you can do that. And it's one of the ways that my students are always very interested in hearing about. It gets them more into battle history when you can show how it changes the way people think. This second to last bullet point down here is absolutely amazing and part of what helps President Truman make his decision to desegregate the military in 1948. Over 80% of white troops and commanders surveyed gave positive assessments of black platoons that they served with and indicated a willingness to serve in a less segregated military.
Hmm.
It's a small start. I'm not at all arguing that this is like some sort of magic pill for the United States, but here we have a small start that comes out of these two gigantic battles. So another thing to remember, along with the social history of this fight, and one more thing, this to end on. American memory of this battle. We go back to where is the 106th Infantry Division today? It doesn't exist. Where is the 99th today? It's not an active duty formation. Its patch is worn by a different reserve component. But what units still exist in the United States military these days? It's generally those who are very, very successful in World War II. So the 101st still exists, the 82nd, the 1st Infantry Division, 3rd, so on and so forth. I could list them to you. We have 10 active duty divisions today, 10 full strength active duty divisions, about the size of our US Army, out of 100 that were active in World War II. Those with the most impressive record from World War II are generally the ones retained. Why is Band of Brothers about the 101st Airborne Division? Not just more of my own bias here, but thinking about how important this battle is to what we remember. Why that epic miniseries? Why Stephen Ambrose's book? Stephen Ambrose, by the way, one of the founders of the National World War II Museum that's down in New Orleans. You should all visit if you ever get the chance. Why the 101st? It can't be just a decision based on Normandy or Market Garden, because the 82nd Airborne is also both of those battles. What separates the 101st from the 82nd and adds just that little bit more to its history, maybe making it the subject of those books, is that it's also in Bastogne. That's its difference. That's what gets it commended to history and memory in those ways. That photo there on the right of a soldier in World War II era uniform, that's Major Dick Winters, who's of course a major character in that battle Band of Brothers series. And one last thing that I'm going to end on here is this is part of how the Army has recently decided to connect itself to history. If you see his World War II era uniform there, maybe you haven't seen an American soldier in dress uniform recently enough to notice the change, but we're switching from the blue uniform that had been brought in not actually very long ago. It was brought in during my time in the service. They were phasing it in by 2009. But it is going back to a full dress, rarer use uniform in favor of going to the uniform being worn by these soldiers in the middle here at a recent Association of the United States Army conference. We're going back to the World War II uniform.
Hmm.
The note that I wanted to end on there is to say that it's these heroic soldiers that fought in battles like the Battle of the Bulge, the Hurtgen Forest, Normandy, Market Garden, and so many more that make our country and our military want to attach itself back to uh, those ancestors, those predecessors, and show that very much in the uniform they wear on a daily basis. So I hope I taught you a few things you didn't already know about the Battle of the Bulge. I bet this is a pretty knowledgeable crowd, though. So maybe I got a couple of few things in for you.
Hmm.
And I don't seem to have put asleep either of the people who were leaving their cameras on. And I really appreciate you both because I was staring you both in the eyes the entire time I talked. It's always helpful to have at least one face
Sorry.
to talk to when you're doing one of these. So I thank you all, and I will finally shut my yapper.
Chad, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for your information. I was sitting there taking a bunch of notes. I love military. I do a lot of military research here at the state library, and I had heard about the Wereth 11,
Mhm.
and I know that one of the soldiers from Wereth 11 was from South Carolina.
Oh
I
no.
wasn't sure if you were
What?
familiar with that, but he was from South Carolina. Um, but does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? We have just a couple minutes before I need to let him go, but does anybody have any questions or comments?
Take your time too.
I just want to say thank you so much. It was
Very,
awesome.
Thank you. It was
Thank you.
very informative.
thanks a lot.
My grandfather was in World War II, and then the neighbor that lived across the street from them, he was actually in the Battle of the Bulge, and
Oh,
he actually told us some stories and all of it. I don't know about my grandfather what all he was in. I know he was in Europe, but I don't. He never really talked about it though. But Mr. Cleve did though.
I have a great uncle who, unfortunately, I wasn't adult enough to have more conversations about where he was in World War II with him, but he was part of the relief of the Bulge, fighting with Patton's Third Army in its move up from the south. And then my family military history continues to be like very, very 101st biased because my uncle fought in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, and then I was in Iraq with them. So you just have to get a different historian to hear about what other people were doing, but we'll always run it through the 101st history, my version. But yeah,
I
I mean,
was going to ask you if you guys needed to be rescued by Patton. I was going to ask you that, but
absolutely
you
not.
covered
It was
it.
fine of him to show up and have dinner with us,
Yes,
but
sir. Absolutely.
we were just sitting there ready, you know.
Well, Dr. Gibbs, I will say my father served in the Battle of the Bulge as well. He was actually captured as a prisoner of war in
Mm,
Germany for several months. And I remember him telling me that it was one of the coldest winters on record
it
um,
was.
at that time. And of course, they had no shelter or anything, so he was outside. But one of the questions I had a couple questions here. Do you think that the United States, the Army or the soldiers were prepared for the cold weather? Do you
Mm,
think that had some kind of effect? Because I mean, it can get cold in the United States, but it can be pretty brutal and bitter over there in the German. And I'm just wondering, were they properly clothed? What do you know anything about how they were
sure.
prepared
They
that
were
way?
not. They were not, particularly, and I don't just mean to continue my bias joke here, but starting with the 101st, who had been thrown into the line to hold Bastogne as quickly as possible. It was expected to be in a rest position, so it did not have its winter gear. It was not ready. It did not have heavy overcoats. It didn't have winter boots. It didn't have these giant white army parkas. None of those. It was woefully ill-equipped for
Short
the,
on ammo also.
yeah,
Yeah.
Right,
just
right. I was gonna say,
totally
I
not.
thought they had plenty, and you're right, Mr. Tony, they didn't have a lot of ammo and all that. And I was just wondering, I think at one time I had read where thankfully an airplane or some Air Force brought in some supplies and
Yeah,
dropped the supplies to the to the U.S. Army so they
they
could
did.
fight.
They
But I know
continually
until
tried
that
doing that.
time, they
It was
were,
harder. Sorry, it was
oh,
harder
that's
in the
okay.
earlier phases of the battle as the wet. I didn't maybe keep up the weather analysis as I was talking here as much as I should have, but in the first few days or even week of the battle, the weather over this area is so bad that the U.S. Air Force can't support trying to stop the German advance, and it also can't get in to drop supplies. So they even had to wait longer for any sort of food or ammunition or winter clothing resupply by paradrop because they just couldn't fly in the conditions that were going on at the time. And statistically, 44, 45 remains one of the coldest winters in Europe. It's just like whatever demons were lumping on the bad fortune of World War II were lumping it on even with the weather of that year. It was terrible. It was incredibly cold. I'll never forget one of the oral histories that they use in the miniseries Band of Brothers is a soldier saying, every time I experience a cold night, I'm getting into bed, and I turn to my wife and I go, at least I'm not
At
in
least,
battle.
that's right. Yeah, man.
Says it every, I can just imagine him saying something like that because it really rang true to me because every time I step out in an incredibly hot Charleston summer and I just like step out into the heat and I go, oh, at least it's not Iraq. So it rings home to me still in that way. But I don't know who Sarah Schroeder is, but that is my mom's maiden name. I'm half Schroeder. So just throwing that out there is because I'm seeing that screen here.
Well, Sarah Schroeder works with me, so I saw her jump on in a few minutes ago, so I was happy to see her hop on. But does anybody else have any questions? I know this was a fantastic presentation, and we are so appreciative of Dr. Gibbs giving up his time and his resources, and just to first of all to make this presentation and to create this presentation. So, and if anybody's interested and want to attend the College of Charleston and take some classes from Dr. Gibbs, he's available. Anyway, any last words before we sign off, Dr. Gibbs?
I don't think so. Just another hearty thank you to the SC State Library and to you for organizing and all of you for attending. Really appreciate it. Obviously, a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm glad that you all attended and that we could find this chance a day before the official end of the battle to commemorate all those who fought in this fight and those who gave their lives and
Okay.
freedom of Europe and ourselves. So thanks again.
Absolutely. We just, I mean, this generation that Tom Brokaw has called the greatest generation surely lived up to their name, and I don't think there'll ever be another generation like it, but I'm a little partial because my parents were part of that greatest generation. So anyway. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for showing up. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.